Ottawa, 1920. The Dominion Elections Act was passed. Overnight, the number of Canadians entitled to vote was doubled. It was said to guarantee universal suffrage to every eligible Canadian, male or female, over 21. It did not. It included a clause stating that people disenfranchised by a province for reason of race would be barred from voting federally. In 1920, British Columbia excluded voters on the basis of race. People of Japanese and Chinese origin, as well as anyone from the Indian subcontinent, were denied the vote. British Columbia had more Asian immigrants than most other provinces. When it entered the Confederation, over 60% of the province's population was of First Nations or Chinese origin. It had a long history of discrimination. Provincial law required that pharmacists, civil servants, and lawyers be on the voters list. It meant Canadians of Japanese and Chinese origin were excluded from these professions. Returning First World War veterans of Japanese origin were still denied the vote. Some had voted in the 1917 federal elections under the Military Voters Act. Upon their return, the right was taken away. In Ottawa, the Solicitor General Hugh Guthrie defended his government's position. He maintained that the new Dominion Elections Act did not discriminate, but merely recognized the provincial disqualification imposed by the law of any province by reason of race. In one House of Commons debate, he said, "This Parliament says upon what terms men shall vote. No Oriental, whether he be Hindu, Japanese, or Chinese, acquires the right to vote simply by the fact of citizenship." In 1936, the Japanese Canadian Citizens League sent a delegation to Ottawa to plead for franchise. A special House of Commons committee is formed to deal with their request. One member from the Japanese Canadian group told the committee that hundreds of young boys and girls, some of them even children of grade school age, have been sacrificing ice cream sodas and movies and contributing their quarters and 50-cent pieces in order that we might appear before you today. The Prime Minister of the time, Mackenzie King, claimed he had been unaware that they wanted the vote. One British Columbian MP said that the whole affair was a plot to enable the Japanese government to plant spies in British Columbia. Another urged the committee not to grant them the vote as it would lead to Japanese Canadians taking over Canada. The franchise was not extended. December 7, 1941, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The federal government under Prime Minister Mackenzie King forced 22,000 Japanese Canadians from their homes in British Columbia. They were sent to internment camps or relocation centers. Their properties and belongings were sold at public auctions. 3 years later, in 1944, the Dominion Elections Act was amended. It now denied the vote to Japanese Canadians forced to move from British Columbia to other provinces. Provinces from where they had not been previously disqualified. It caused heated debate in the House of Commons. "When it comes to racial discrimination against anybody, count me out," said one Liberal MP from Toronto. Other MPs from across the country echoed his objection. Others supported the disenfranchisement. One British Columbia MP remarked the Japanese Canadians were being spread all over Canada like the smallpox disease. "This is white man's country, and we want it left a white man's country." Prime Minister King denied the amendment was racist. "The Japanese Canadians living in other provinces are still citizens of British Columbia and subject to its laws," he said. 1945 marked the end of the Second World War. For decades, Japanese Canadians had fought for franchise. After the war, others joined the fight. Massive protests across the country stopped the government from its attempt to deport 10,000 Japanese Canadians. Public opinion began to shift. One contemporary historian has noted that the most virulently anti-Japanese MPs lost their seats to more moderate members. The tide was turning. Prime Minister Mackenzie King decided to yield to public opinion. In 1947, the discriminatory clause in the British Columbian Provincial Elections Act was repealed. Chinese Canadians and Indo-Canadians were given the right to vote. Japanese Canadians were still excluded. Then, on June 15, 1948, after a short debate in the House of Commons, the reference to discrimination in the franchise on the basis of race was removed. All Japanese Canadians could finally vote federally. One reporter wrote, "After much prodding, the House of Commons has moved to right a most humiliating wrong. Unfortunately, it was not within its power to remove the stigma completely." It was a year later, in 1949, that Japanese Canadians got the provincial right to vote in British Columbia. On Election Day, one elderly Japanese resident said, "When I voted, I felt like I could finally join the human race."